The snowstorm had arrived without warning, swirling fiercely through the streets of a small town, as if nature itself had decided to reclaim the world for a few hours. Ella stood at her kitchen window, watching the white flakes whip across the empty street. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the air was thick with the weight of winter. The storm was relentless, one of those rare, bitterly cold storms that seemed to freeze time itself. The world outside had gone quiet, save for the muffled sound of wind against snow and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Ella wasn't sure why she decided to step out into it. Perhaps she needed to feel something other than the heaviness in her chest. It had been a long, lonely month. Work was exhausting, the days blending into one another, and every night seemed to stretch into a quiet, empty space. She felt disconnected, like she was watching life from a distance, unable to participate. So, despite the storm, she bundled up in her thick winter coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped outside. The cold air hit her face like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. She pulled her hood tighter, tucking her hands deep into her pockets. The street was deserted, save for the occasional car struggling through the thickening snow. Ella walked slowly, her boots crunching against the ice, the sound of each step muffled by the thick layer of snow. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to move, to feel something other than the numbness that had settled deep inside her. As she walked, her mind wandered. She thought about the past few months, how everything seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The emptiness was palpable, a gnawing ache she couldn't shake. She had grown so used to being alone that it felt like the natural state of things. The storm mirrored the turmoil in her heart, a chaotic swirl of thoughts and emotions, all tangled together. But then, just as she rounded the corner of the street, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the storm, something buried in the snow, a patch of fur or debris. But as she got closer, the figure became clearer, a small, huddled shape, barely visible beneath the heavy blanket of white. It was so still that for a moment, Ella thought it might be some kind of illusion, the wind playing tricks on her mind. But as she approached, her heart skipped a beat. There in the thick snow was a tiny hedgehog. Ella's breath caught in her throat. The creature was small, vulnerable, and shivering violently. Its tiny body seemed to be frozen in place, covered in a thin layer of snow, its little paws barely moving. It was hard to tell whether it was even alive, but Ella's instinct screamed at her to act. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees in the snow, feeling the cold seep through her jeans, and gently cupped the hedgehog in her hands. It was colder than she expected, its body rigid and stiff, almost lifeless. Her hands shook as she felt for its pulse. There was none. Her heart raced in her chest as panic rose up, choking her thoughts. She had no idea how to help it, no idea what to do, but she couldn't just leave it there. Not like this. The storm raged around her, the wind whipping her hair and snowflakes stinging her face. But Ella was focused only on the tiny creature in her hands. She wrapped it carefully in her scarf, cradling it close to her chest, feeling its fragile body pressed against her warmth. The tiny hedgehog was barely breathing, its little chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Ella stood up, the weight of the creature pulling her down as she struggled to keep her footing in the snow. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so urgently connected to something. The hedgehog seemed to be calling out to her, its frailty demanding action. Without hesitation, she turned and walked quickly back to her house, clutching the animal tightly to her, her mind racing. Inside, the warmth of her home hit her like a rush of relief. She carefully laid the hedgehog on the couch, its small form trembling under the layers of fabric. The snowstorm outside was just a blur now. There was only her, the creature, and the growing panic in her chest. Ella's mind went blank. She didn't know what to do next. The hedgehog's tiny eyes flickered, its body jerking in distress, and she realized she couldn't just sit there and hope for the best. She needed help, someone who knew what to do. Her heart pounded as she pulled out her phone, her fingers numb from the cold, and typed a message into the local online group. "I found a tiny hedgehog freezing in the snow. I don't know what to do. Please, can anyone help? Her hands trembled as she hit send. The cold from the storm still lingered in her bones, but it wasn't the weather that was freezing her now. It was the uncertainty, the feeling that she might be too late, that she might have found this small creature only to fail it. She watched the little hedgehog, its body still, its breath shallow. All Ella could do now was wait. Wait for help to arrive, and hope it wasn't too late. Ella stood there, her fingers trembling as she watched the tiny hedgehog lie motionless on her couch. The warmth of her apartment felt surreal against the cold that still gripped her, a stark contrast to the icy panic coursing through her veins. The hedgehog, its tiny body wrapped in her scarf, its eyes barely open, was still so fragile, so close to the edge of life. She could feel its shallow breath under her fingertips, but there was no sign of improvement. The storm outside continued its relentless assault against the world. But here, inside her small living room, it was as though time had frozen. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking like an echo in the quiet room. It felt like an eternity had passed since she'd found the hedgehog, but the minutes were slipping away, and she hadn't done anything. What could she do? She wasn't a wildlife expert or even someone who had ever dealt with something like this. She felt utterly helpless. The weight of it pressed on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Her phone felt strangely heavy in her hand, but she knew she needed to reach out. She had no other choice. The thought of just sitting there, helplessly watching the little creature suffer, made her stomach twist. She wasn't going to let it freeze, not when there was a chance to save it. With a deep, steadying breath, she unlocked her phone and opened the local community group page. Her fingers hesitated for a moment as she tried to form the right words. It felt so simple, yet so urgent. This wasn't just some passing inconvenience. It was a life. I found a tiny hedgehog freezing in the snow. I don't know what to do. Please, can anyone help? Her thumb hovered over the send button for a moment longer than necessary. Was this the right call? She had no idea who would even see this, let alone what they could do. But then again, what else could she do? The storm was too fierce for her to drive anywhere, and even if she could, she didn't have the resources or knowledge to help an animal in this state. She hit send. The silence in the room was almost suffocating as Ella set the phone down beside her and returned to the hedgehog. She carefully adjusted its position, tucking it back into the blanket, hoping that maybe her warmth would help, even though she knew it wasn't enough. The storm outside roared louder, and Ella found herself watching the snowflakes swirl and dance in the wind through the window, wishing for something, anything, to change. Her phone buzzed. It was a response. Ella's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly grabbed it. Her eyes scanned the message. "I'm a wildlife rescuer. I can come over and help. Don't worry." James. Ella didn't need to think twice. Her relief was palpable, a wave of comfort washing over her as she read those words. Help was coming. Her breath, which she hadn't realized she'd been holding, finally escaped in a long, shaky exhale. James was a name she recognized from the community, someone who had worked with wildlife in the area for years. She had never met him in person, but she knew his reputation. Ella felt a surge of gratitude, a small but powerful spark of hope flickering inside her. She quickly responded, "Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so scared I'm too late." The reply came almost immediately. "It's okay. I'll be there soon. Stay with the animal. Keep it warm." Ella nodded to herself, though James couldn't see her. She felt a strange comfort in knowing that someone who knew what they were doing was on their way. Her fingers were still cold from the storm, but now, the shiver that ran through her wasn't from the weather. It was anticipation, mixed with a lingering fear that gripped her gut. Would it be enough? Was the hedgehog too far gone? As she sat there, waiting, the minutes dragged on. Every few seconds, she checked her phone, hoping for an update, but there was nothing. The hedgehog seemed to be holding on, though just barely. Its little face was so delicate, so small, and Ella couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile life was resting on a knife's edge. Suddenly, another buzz from her phone broke through the silence. Ella grabbed it quickly, but it wasn't James. This time, it was a message from Claire. "Hi, I saw your post. I have a portable heater if you need it. Let me know if I can help in any way." Ella blinked in surprise. The idea of a portable heater hadn't even crossed her mind. The thought of bringing warmth to the small creature, something to help stabilize its body temperature, was exactly what she needed. She quickly typed back, "Yes, please. That would be amazing." Within minutes, Claire, a woman she had seen around town a few times, appeared at her doorstep, carrying a heater large enough to fill half the living room. She smiled warmly as she entered, a practical, motherly aura about her that immediately put Ella at ease. "Don't worry, Han will figure this out," Claire said as she set up the heater beside the couch. "Just keep it wrapped up and warm until James gets here. We'll make sure it's okay." Ella couldn't help but feel a deep wave of gratitude. The fact that someone who barely knew her was showing up like this, without hesitation, brought a tear to her eye. She hadn't realized how much she needed reassurance until this moment. As Claire made sure the hedgehog was positioned comfortably, Ella heard another buzz from her phone. It was Jake, a local veterinarian whom she had met a few times at the grocery store, always carrying that calm, gentle energy. "I'm available if you need me. I can come check on the hedgehog's health as well." Ella felt an almost surreal sense of relief wash over her as she read his message. She had posted out of desperation, thinking maybe someone might have advice, and now a small team of strangers, people she hadn't known well but had always seen in passing, were coming together, working as one to save this tiny animal. She sent a quick reply to Jake. "Please, I would appreciate that so much. Thank you." The minutes that followed felt both too long and too short. Ella, Claire, and the hedgehog waited together. Claire continued to warm the space with the heater, and Ella kept talking softly to the tiny creature, though she wasn't sure it could hear her. The simple act of holding the hedgehog close, trying to keep it as warm as possible, made her feel connected to something larger than herself. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she was part of something meaningful. And then, the doorbell rang. It was James. James stepped into the room with quiet authority, carrying with him an air of calm that seemed to absorb some of the tension hanging in the space. He was dressed in a well-worn jacket, his dark boots leaving faint traces of snow behind as he moved toward the couch where the hedgehog lay. His eyes quickly assessed the situation, an experienced wildlife rescuer's gaze that was both sharp and gentle. He didn't waste any time. "Okay," James said softly, as he knelt beside the tiny creature. "Let's take a look." Ella stepped back, allowing him the space to work. Her hands still trembled, not just from the cold, but from the quiet fear that the hedgehog might not make it. The room, filled with the soft hum of the heater Claire had brought, seemed impossibly warm and peaceful in comparison to the storm still raging outside. Yet, the stillness between them all was thick with anticipation. Claire had been busy in the background, carefully adjusting the heater settings to make sure the temperature was just right. She had brought over some towels, and now she was folding them with deliberate care, as if tending to an ancient ritual. She smiled reassuringly at Ella, though there was a quiet concern in her eyes. "Let me know if I can do anything," she said, her voice steady but carrying a sense of warmth that Ella couldn't help but appreciate. Ella gave a small, grateful nod, but all she could do was watch James work. His hands, calloused and steady, moved gently as he placed the hedgehog on a clean towel. He worked quickly, but with a kind focus, checking its tiny limbs and making sure the little animal was still breathing. Claire, sensing Ella's unease, walked over and placed a cup of tea in her hands. The warmth of the mug seeped into her palms, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She hadn't realized how badly she needed this. Anyone, to share the burden of her worry. "Where did you find it?" Claire asked quietly, her voice soft as she took a seat beside Ella. Ella glanced out the window, lost in the memory of that moment. Just outside, near the old oak tree on the corner. It was barely moving, shivering so hard, I thought it might be too late already. Claire nodded, sipping her own tea, her eyes drifting to the small creature James was now carefully tending to. "That's the thing with animals in the cold," she said almost to herself. "They don't have a lot of time once the temperature drops too low. But if we can get it warm again, we might just pull it through." Ella stared down at the hedgehog, her heart still aching at how fragile it looked. Do you really think it can make it? Maybe, Claire said, her tone not dismissive, but measured. Animals like this are tougher than we think. They just need a little help when they're on the brink. Ella wasn't sure if it was Claire's words or the warmth from the tea, but she felt a shift. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding on to the fear of failure until now. Perhaps it was the shared presence of these strangers, this unexpected team, that made her feel like this could work. They weren't alone in this. None of them were. As she processed Claire's words, she noticed a figure standing in the doorway. Jake, the local veterinarian, had arrived. His easygoing smile instantly put her at ease, and for a moment, Ella found herself catching her breath. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed someone like him, someone who understood what to do when everything seemed uncertain. "Hey folks," Jake greeted, his voice warm and with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years helping animals. "Let's see how we're doing here." He approached the couch with a gentle presence, kneeling beside James. Together, they exchanged a few quiet words, and James stepped aside slightly to give Jake a closer look. Ella could feel the weight of Jake's gaze, not as a judgment, but as a quiet appraisal, the way a doctor might examine a patient in need of care. It was both comforting and a little intimidating. Jake moved in, his hands careful but precise as he gently lifted the hedgehog's tiny body. "It's weak, but its heart is still going strong." "That's good," he murmured. He reached into his bag for a set of tools, each item pulled out with professional efficiency. Ella watched intently as Jake checked the hedgehog's limbs and examined its eyes. There was a quiet rhythm to their movements, James and Jake working together as if they had done this countless times before. Ella felt strangely disconnected from the moment, like she was an observer, watching a scene she had never expected to be a part of. The room felt full of purpose now, the energy around her shifting from frantic worry to quiet focus. She glanced at Claire, who had settled back into the chair, still holding her tea. Her smile was soft, reassuring. "You know," Claire said, her voice still calm despite the urgency of the situation, "you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to step up when there's something that needs doing. It's nice, don't you think?" Ella took a sip of her tea, still a little dazed by the unfolding events. She nodded slowly. It wasn't just the fact that help had arrived. It was the way they all seemed to fall into their roles, not out of obligation, but out of a shared willingness to be part of something greater than themselves. Jake finished his examination, then looked up at Ella. "We're doing all right. I'm going to administer some fluids and keep it warm for a while longer. But I think it's going to pull through." Ella exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It wasn't a promise, but it was the closest thing she had to hope. Her shoulders, which had been tight with fear, seemed to loosen a little, though the worry still simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without all of you." James and Jake exchanged glances, both of them offering small smiles. "It's no problem," James said. "We do this because it matters. It's not about being a hero. It's about being there when something needs help." Jake nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it's just about showing up." The words hung in the air, simple but profound, as if they had all just acknowledged something fundamental in that moment. Ella realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about the connections that were formed in moments of vulnerability, about the unexpected ways people came together when there was a shared purpose. For the first time in a long while, Ella felt like part of something bigger than herself. The hedgehog, fragile and small, had become a bridge, connecting her to others in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the evening stretched on, the group settled into an easy rhythm. James and Jake continued to care for the hedgehog. Claire offered quiet suggestions, and Ella found herself becoming part of the process, helping, learning, and slowly shedding the heaviness that had been weighing her down. The storm outside raged on, but here inside a different kind of warmth had taken root. And for Ella, it was enough to know that no one was alone in this. The minutes stretched into hours as Ella sat beside the couch, watching the small hedgehog with a quiet intensity. The soft hiss of the heater and the occasional murmur of the men discussing the hedgehog's care filled the otherwise peaceful room. Outside, the snowstorm had reached its peak, but in the warmth of Ella's apartment, time seemed to move in its own rhythm. one that felt both painfully slow and unexpectedly comforting. James and Jake had moved into a steady routine, carefully tending to the hedgehog's frail body. The creature had shown small signs of improvement, its breathing steadier and its little legs less stiff. But the battle wasn't over yet. It was still too early to know for sure whether it would make it, and that knowledge hung in the air like a silent, unspoken truth. Ella shifted in her seat, her eyes never leaving the hedgehog. She had been so certain it was too late, so sure that by the time she had found it in the snow, it would be beyond saving. Now, though, as she watched the tiny creature stir slightly, a flicker of hope danced in her chest. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. She tried to focus on the conversation around her, but her mind kept wandering back to the moment she had found the hedgehog, its fragile form trembling beneath the snow. She had been scared then, overcome with a panic she couldn't shake. But now, surrounded by these strangers, people who, until this very evening, had been little more than faces in her community, Ella felt something shift. A sense of connection not just to them, but to the little creature that had sparked it all. Claire was sitting nearby, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the hedgehog with a quiet, maternal concern. She had said little after her initial comforting words, but her presence was a quiet support. It was the kind of steady calm that Ella had desperately needed, though she hadn't known it at the time. "You're doing well," Claire said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was warm, a gentle reassurance in the face of the unknown. "Animals like this can surprise you. They're resilient," Ella nodded, but she couldn't help but wonder just how much resilience the hedgehog had left. What if it didn't make it? What if all their efforts, the warmth and care they'd given, weren't enough? But she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the small signs of life. The slow rise and fall of the hedgehog's chest, the occasional flicker of its eyes. James and Jake had continued to check its vitals, each one nodding to the other in quiet agreement. "It's going to take time," James said as he stood up, stretching his back with a soft groan. "But it's stable now. That's the important part." Jake, who had been busy preparing a few more medications for the hedgehog, glanced over at Ella. "Sometimes all they need is patience. It's like with people. They have their own way of healing, and it's not always linear." Ella gave a small smile, appreciating the kindness in his words. She hadn't known what to expect from this experience. If anything, it had been more intense, more uncertain than she'd imagined. But it was in these moments of uncertainty that the real healing seemed to happen, both for the hedgehog and for her. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of genuine gratitude. I didn't think it would make it this far." James looked at her with a soft smile, one that seemed to carry both relief and understanding. "You did your part. You brought it in, kept it warm. That's the hardest part." Ella's throat tightened slightly, the weight of those words sinking in. She had felt so powerless when she found the hedgehog, so afraid that she couldn't do anything to help it. But now, she could see the truth of James's words. It wasn't just about saving the hedgehog, it was about showing up, doing what she could, and letting others step in when needed. She hadn't been alone in this, and that in itself was an unexpected kind of strength. She turned her attention back to the hedgehog, which was now resting quietly, its tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It was no longer trembling, no longer stiff with cold. It was small, fragile, but it was alive, and for now, that was enough. Claire stood up, walking over to the small table where she had set down a few additional supplies earlier. "I'll check on the heater and get a few more towels," she said. "We need to keep it cozy for the next few hours." Ella nodded absently, still staring at the hedgehog. "Thank you. I don't know how to explain what this means to me." Claire gave her a kind, knowing smile as she left the room, leaving Ella alone with the quiet relief that had begun to settle in her heart. There was a sense of peace in this moment, a shift from frantic worry to cautious hope. For the first time in what felt like a long time, Ella felt as though she could breathe a little easier. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness, and she looked down at it, surprised to see a message from her sister Mia. "How's it going? Everything okay?" Ella hesitated for a moment before typing back. "I think we're going to make it. The hedgehog's hanging on, I don't know how, but it is. She paused, staring at the screen for a moment before adding, "It's funny how everything can change in just a few hours. I feel like I've learned something tonight." She hit send, and almost immediately Mia replied, "I'm so proud of you. You're always stronger than you realize." Ella smiled softly, her heart full. She wasn't sure what exactly she had learned, but she knew it was something important. Perhaps it was the reminder that life, no matter how small or fragile, could always surprise you. And maybe, just maybe, Ella was beginning to understand that she had a part to play in it, whether she was saving a hedgehog, or learning to be a part of a community, or simply allowing others to show up when she needed them most. As the storm continued to rage outside, Ella felt the smallest flicker of peace in her chest. It wasn't over yet, but she knew it was possible. And that was enough for now. The night wore on, and the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled against the windows, its eerie whistle a constant reminder of the chaos beyond the walls. But inside, the room felt like an oasis, warm, quiet, filled with a soft, steady hum of activity that brought a sense of purpose and calm. Ella was no longer just a passive observer. She had become part of the process, her hands more confident as she helped adjust the blankets around the hedgehog. The small creature was still resting, its tiny body wrapped carefully in layers of warmth, but its breathing was more even, less strained. The signs were subtle but undeniable. They were winning this fight. Jake, who had been meticulously checking the hedgehog's temperature, now stood up and stretched his arms above his head. "I think we're in the clear," he said, his voice low, but with a note of relief in it. "It's stable now. Its temperature's back up to normal, and the shivering has stopped. We'll need to keep an eye on it for the next few hours, but for now, it's a good sign." Ella let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her shoulders, which had been tight with the fear of losing the little creature, sagged in quiet relief. She hadn't even noticed how deeply the anxiety had been weighing on her until that moment. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her chest, allowing her to breathe again. She glanced at Claire, who was sitting in the armchair, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "See? It just needed some time and care," Claire said, offering a soft smile. Her tone was the same as always, gentle, calm. But there was something more in her voice now, something that spoke of quiet pride. Ella nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without all of you." James, who had been standing by the window, now turned back toward them, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a reminder, really, that even the smallest actions matter. You saw it on the sidewalk that day. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't brought it inside, this little one might not have made it." Ella met his gaze, her eyes softening with the weight of his words. She hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't allowed herself to believe that she could make a difference in something so fragile. But now, as she looked at the hedgehog, alive and breathing steadily, she could see the truth of it. "It's strange," Ella said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't even know why I stopped. I don't know, I guess I was scared. But something made me pick it up. Something made me carry it inside." Claire smiled again, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sometimes, fear is the first thing we have to face before we can act. It's easier to stand back and do nothing, to let the fear paralyze us. But you didn't. You made the choice to act, and look where it's brought us." Ella's heart clenched with something deeper than just relief, something akin to awe. She had been so afraid of not knowing what to do, so afraid of making the wrong choice. But what she had learned tonight was that sometimes the right choice wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, about taking action even when the path ahead was unclear. She glanced down at the hedgehog again, her fingers lightly brushing its tiny spines. It was still small and fragile, but it was no longer the shivering, lifeless creature she had found in the snow. It had been given a second chance, and Ella realized that in a way, so had she. The room seemed to breathe with a soft, collective exhale as James and Jake began to clean up their supplies. The tension that had lingered in the air for hours now seemed to dissipate. But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about saving the hedgehog. It was about the way people had come together, strangers who had shared something far more profound than just a desire to help an animal. They had shared their presence, their kindness, and in return, they had all been changed in ways big and small. Jake sat down across from Ella, his expression relaxed. "I'll stay for a little longer, just to make sure everything's okay," he said, his voice gentle but full of experience. "But it's looking good. We can probably release it back into the wild tomorrow, after it's had a good rest. Just need to keep it warm until then." Ella nodded, her mind still racing, her thoughts tangled with everything that had happened that evening. "Tomorrow," she repeated softly. It was almost surreal to think about the hedgehog being strong enough to leave. She had grown attached to it in a way she hadn't expected, and the idea of letting go, of releasing it back into the cold, snowy night, felt bittersweet. "It's the right thing," Claire said, sensing Ella's hesitation. "It needs to be free, and it's not ours to keep. You did your part, and now it can live its life." Ella smiled faintly, the idea settling into her heart like a warm weight. She could do that. She could let go. It was the right thing, as Claire said. The hedgehog would be stronger for it, just as Ella was stronger for having made the choice to help. It wasn't always easy, this giving, this letting go, but it was necessary. James, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know, it's not just the hedgehog who's made it through tonight. We all did. It's easy to forget, but when you pull together like this, you find something you didn't know you needed." Ella turned to look at him, his words striking deep. The night had been full of surprises, of unexpected moments of kindness and courage. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this, how much she had needed them. She glanced at each of them, Claire, Jake, James, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. They had all come together in ways that she could never have predicted, and the bond they shared was undeniable, a connection formed in the heat of the moment, bound by the shared goal of saving something so small and fragile. She felt a sudden wave of gratitude wash over her, stronger than the relief that had settled in her chest. It wasn't just about the hedgehog anymore. It was about everything that had happened here, about the kindness, the community, the way they had all chosen to show up for something bigger than themselves. The storm outside raged on, but inside, Ella was no longer afraid. Tomorrow, she would let the hedgehog go, and tomorrow, she would carry this lesson with her, that even in the coldest, darkest moments, there is always hope. There is always a flicker of light waiting to be found. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give is the chance for something or someone to be free. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting long, golden streaks across the room. Ella awoke with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The storm outside had cleared overnight, leaving the world washed clean, the snow sparkling in the early light as if it had been freshly laid. It was the kind of morning that felt full of possibility, like the world was giving her a second chance, just as it had done for the hedgehog. She stretched slowly, feeling the warmth of the blankets around her before pulling herself out of bed. Her feet hit the cool floor, but there was no sharp chill in the air anymore. The warmth of the room, the gentle hum of the heater, the quiet comfort of knowing that the little creature was still alive, all of it felt like a promise that things were going to be okay. The hedgehog had spent the night in a small enclosure Claire had set up for it, nestled in blankets and resting on a heat pad to maintain its warmth. Its small body was still, but its breathing had deepened, more regular, more peaceful. It no longer looked fragile, as it had the day before. There was a resilience in its tiny form, a strength that had quietly emerged over the course of the night. Ella walked into the living room, her footsteps light on the hardwood floor. The others had arrived early. James, Claire, and Jake had agreed to stay for a while longer to help with the final steps of the hedgehog's recovery. The air was full of a quiet energy as they prepared to release the animal back into the wild. There was no rush, no frantic movement. It was as if the slow, steady care they had all given had created a space for patience, a space where time seemed to bend, offering the chance for something beautiful to unfold. Claire was sitting on the couch, sipping her coffee. She looked up as Ella entered the room, her smile warm and comforting. "Morning," she greeted softly. "How are you feeling?" Ella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few days lift off her shoulders. "Better," she replied. I think I'm ready." It was an understatement, but Claire understood the sentiment. It wasn't just about the hedgehog anymore. It was about everything that had led them here. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotion, of worry and hope, of strangers becoming something more, of unexpected kindness weaving its way through a community that had once felt distant and disconnected. Ella had learned, in the quiet of those moments spent caring for the small creature, that there was strength in vulnerability, in showing up even when the path wasn't clear. James and Jake were in the kitchen, quietly discussing the final steps of the release. The hedgehog needed to be strong enough to survive on its own, but the signs were promising. The little creature had been fed, hydrated, and given time to warm. Now it was ready to return to its natural home, where it belonged. Ella stood at the window for a moment, gazing out at the world outside. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a crystalline stillness. Everything was so quiet, as if the world itself was waiting for the moment of release. "I've been thinking about it," Ella said, her voice soft, almost to herself. "It's strange. I never expected to feel so attached to something so small." "I think that's part of it," Claire said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes the smallest things have the biggest impact. We forget that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. It's easy to get lost in the noise of life, but moments like this, they remind us of the beauty in being present." Ella smiled faintly, turning away from the window to look at the small hedgehog, still nestled in its blanket, its eyes half open, as if sensing the change in the air. There was a quiet dignity in the way it lay there, its tiny form strong and still, the little breaths it took now steady and sure. "We're doing the right thing," Ella murmured, her fingers brushing lightly over the hedgehog's spines. "It's time." James and Jake walked in then, their faces more serious, their steps deliberate. James was holding the small container that had been the hedgehog's temporary home. "It's time," he agreed, his voice low but full of a quiet confidence. "This little one's ready." Ella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision in her chest. Letting go was never easy, but the moment had arrived. The hedgehog had fought to survive, and now it was time to give it the freedom it deserved. Jake stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You've done your part," he said gently. "You've given it a chance. Now, we just have to trust that it can do the rest." Ella nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The hedgehog had been given a second chance, just as she had, and now she would let it go, trusting that the world would offer what it needed to survive. She had given it warmth, care, and love, and now it was time for it to be free. The group walked outside, the cool air refreshing after the warmth of the apartment. The snow had started to melt in places, the ground beneath their feet soft with fresh, wet earth. There was something cleansing about it, the way the world seemed to reset itself after the storm. Ella held the box gently in her hands, feeling the faint flutter of the hedgehog's tiny heart beneath her palms. They reached the edge of the woods, where the trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. Ella crouched down, placing the box on the ground in front of her. She hesitated for just a moment, then slowly opened the lid. The hedgehog didn't move at first, its small body still. But then, with a cautious movement, it scurried out of the box, its tiny feet making soft, quick patterns in the snow. For a moment, it paused, as if uncertain, looking up at Ella and the others. Then, as if it understood, it turned and began to move away, its tiny body disappearing into the underbrush, leaving behind only a small trail in the snow. Ella stood there, her breath caught in her chest. The world felt different now, lighter somehow. She didn't know how long she stood there, watching the small creature disappear, but when it was gone, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. "We did good," Jake said, his voice soft, almost reverent. Ella turned to face him, Claire, and James, and for the first time in days, she smiled, truly smiled, a smile that felt like the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't just about saving a hedgehog, but about reclaiming hope, about learning that sometimes the hardest thing is letting go. But in that letting go, there was freedom, for both the hedgehog and for her. "We did," Ella agreed softly, her heart full. And as the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the forest and the promise of new beginnings, she realized that she had, in a way, let herself go too, free from the fear, the doubt, and the uncertainty that had once held her back. She had given everything she had, and in return, she had found the strength to move forward, not just for the hedgehog, but for herself. The world felt quieter now, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the next step. But Ella no longer felt afraid. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life, and that sometimes letting go was the greatest gift of all. The days that followed the hedgehog's release were marked by a subtle shift in Ella's world. The storm had passed, both outside and within her. Where once there had been a gnawing sense of uncertainty, now there was a quiet clarity that seemed to color every corner of her life. It wasn't as if everything had suddenly fallen into place, but the weight of the unknown had lifted. Ella felt as though she were standing a little taller, breathing a little easier. The feeling of peace, so fragile and elusive just days ago, had settled into her bones like a well-worn coat on a chilly morning. The first few mornings after the release, Ella found herself waking up a little earlier than usual, the soft light of dawn streaming through her window. She would sit up in bed, looking out at the world beyond her small apartment, at the trees, the rooftops, the stretch of street where she had once felt so disconnected from everything. But now, as she sipped her coffee and gazed out at the familiar sights, she saw them with new eyes. The world felt larger somehow, more expansive. The life around her was still, but there was an undercurrent of possibility beneath it all. Ella had learned something profound during the past week, something that had gradually unraveled itself in her heart. The act of rescuing the hedgehog, of showing up for something so small and fragile, had opened her eyes to a larger truth, that nothing in life was truly separate. The hedgehog had needed her, and in turn, it had given her the chance to step out of her comfort zone, to connect with others in a way she hadn't expected. On her way to work one morning, she saw a woman walking down the street with a basket of freshly picked flowers, her arms full and her face radiant in the soft morning light. Ella smiled as she passed her by. A simple moment, but it was filled with light. The woman had paused at the curb for a moment, and for some reason, that brief, unspoken exchange of smiles felt like an echo of the kindness that had been shown to her, and that she, in turn, had offered. It was these little moments, she realized, that made all the difference. The seemingly insignificant interactions that wove the fabric of daily life together. And just like the hedgehog, sometimes these moments needed a little space to breathe, a little warmth to thrive. Her coworkers had noticed the change too. There was a lightness to her, a certain ease in the way she interacted with them. When she returned to the office after her impromptu days of caring for the hedgehog, she felt like a different person, not drastically changed, but subtly more present, more open. The walls she had unknowingly built around herself had started to crumble, piece by piece. Ella had begun to recognize how deeply she had been disconnected from those around her, how much she had been holding back out of fear, uncertainty, and even a kind of self-preservation. During lunch one afternoon, her colleague, Marissa, who had always been friendly but distant, asked her how she had spent her weekend. It was a simple question, one that many coworkers might ask, but Ella noticed that there was a new curiosity in Marissa's voice. She hesitated for only a moment, then found herself answering with more honesty than she had expected. I spent the weekend helping a little hedgehog that was found in the snow. It was pretty unexpected, but I think I learned a lot from it. Marissa raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. A hedgehog? How did that happen? Ella laughed softly, the sound more natural than she had expected. I found it shivering in the snow, barely alive. It was a group of strangers who helped take care of it, and, well, we managed to get it back to health and release it. It was kind of incredible. For a moment, there was silence, and then Marissa's face softened. That sounds like a really special experience. It was, and Ella realized that it had been special for reasons far deeper than just the act of saving an animal. It was special because it had cracked open a part of her that she hadn't realized had been closed off. The experience had shown her that sometimes the most profound changes happen in the most unexpected places, in moments of connection, of kindness, of giving without expecting anything in return. That evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ella found herself reflecting on the larger truths that had unfolded over the course of the week. The feeling of loss she had carried with her for so long, loss of purpose, of direction, of connection, had given way to something else. She didn't need to have all the answers, she realized. Life didn't require that. All it asked was that she show up, that she be present, that she care, even when it felt uncertain, even when it felt impossible. As she sat there, a breeze stirring the leaves of the tree outside her apartment, Ella realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the same way. She had let go of something, the fear that had always held her back, the sense that she wasn't enough, or that she had no place in the world. She had released those things, just as she had released the hedgehog into the wild. The world was vast and full of possibility, and for the first time, she truly believed that she had a place in it. The hedgehog, in its quiet way, had opened a door for Ella, and though she had been uncertain at first, now she knew she had walked through it. The experience had transformed her, not by changing who she was, but by helping her rediscover the parts of herself she had forgotten. The parts that could give and receive kindness without reservation, that could step into uncertainty without fear. And, perhaps most importantly, she had learned to trust. Trust that the world would meet her halfway. Trust that the connections she sought were there waiting for her, if only she took the first step. As the evening stretched on, Ella stood and turned back inside, feeling the weight of the day fall away, the quiet calm of the night settling in her bones. There was no grand revelation, no sudden shift, but there was peace. And for Ella, that was enough. Tomorrow, she would wake up again, and in that simple, quiet morning, she would remember life was about the small things, the fleeting moments of connection, the willingness to give what you had to offer, and the courage to let go when it was time. She didn't need to know everything. She only needed to show up and let life unfold, one kind gesture at a time. And as she closed her eyes that night, the weight of the world on her chest felt lighter, as if the hedgehog's freedom had somehow become her own. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.